Hello there and welcome to another Bobeats video, and I'm of course really excited today because we have the SYNTAKT here. It's a 12-voice analog and digital Groovebox. It's also a drum machine and also an effects processor. So you can take your hardware synths and drum machines and process it through its analog and digital effects. And yes, I'm of course really excited about the SYNTAKT. I'm a big Elektron fan. I've done a lot of videos on the Digitakt. It's one of my favorite pieces of gear. So big thank you to Elektron for sending the SYNTAKT over so I could be making this in-depth long-form video here for you all. And also a big thank you to today's sponsor, DistroKid. So if you want to get your music onto Spotify and iTunes and other great stores, check out DistroKid, linked in the description. They are an affordable service to getting your music out there. Now sit down, relax, have a sip of that coffee, and let's listen to the SYNTAKT. Now let's start with the machines. If you are familiar with the Digitakt or Digitone, you will feel right at home with the SYNTAKT. Instead of the 8 sample tracks that we have on the Digitakt, we now have 8 digital synth voices and 4 analog ones. There's no dedicated MIDI tracks, however, so instead you can turn any of the 12 tracks into a MIDI track, which works basically like on the Digitakt. And in addition to the delay and the reverb that we know from the Digitakt, we also have an analog effects block with, for example, a drive, we have a filter, we have an amp section, as well as dedicated LFOs and a dedicated effects track, which is independent of the other 12 tracks. The way you create sounds and music on the SYNTAKT is that you load different machines. The SYNTAKT can also make pretty nice acid bass lines. It's similar to how the motorcycles and analog rhythm works, and you'll see some similarities between the sound machines on these devices and the SYNTAKT. In terms of the digital machines, we have this kick drum here, K control, sweep control, so pitch sweep. We have some modulation, triangle modulation and feedback. And some square wave modulation as well. And you can create a number of different sounds, and here's just an example of one track with just that machine. We then have snare basic and we have snare vintage. And they can sound pretty different, so here's with the kick. We also have a machine that does claps, and just like all the other machines, you can do a wide range of sounds using it. We also have a cymbal machine. We also have this percussive machine. So those are the more percussive-oriented digital machines, and what you can do is you can hit function and effects, and then route these tracks, any of the 12 tracks, through the analog effects block. We then have the analog drum-oriented or percussive machines, and they're very similar to the ones found on the analog rhythm. I can't tell if they're exactly the same, but they sound similar. And especially nice is the overdrive, because on the analog tracks, it really beefs up the sound in a really nice way. So here's an example of the hard bass drum. Classic bass drum. So as you can hear, you can do a lot of different sounds with these machines. Here's the FM bass drum, which can do a nice kick, but can also do some more FM-ish type sounds. And here's some analog hi-hats. Let's take all of this and send it to the analog effects block. We then have the digital melodic machines, so it's synth bits, synth chord, synth tone, and synth toy. And to give you an example, here's synth bits. So we have control over wave. As well as sample rates. And bit reduction. We can also mix in some noise. We then have the chord machine. And here we have control over the type of chord. We can also select between different waveforms. We then have the synth tone. It's basically an FM style synth voice. Lastly, we have synth toy, which you can use to make some kind of bell type sounds, but also pretty cool like bass. On the analog side, we have the dual VCO synth. And you can use this to create a really big kick drum. You can do a lot of things. So this is just one track. It's just a dual VCO synth. So everything is one track. do more melodic stuff with it. What I think is one of the coolest features of the Syntakt, at least to me, is how well it works with Elektron's CTRL All function. CTRL All means that you can change the sound settings for all the tracks and all the machines just using a combination of holding down track and turning a knob. This has a lot of creative potential. You can take a pattern and just change it up to something completely different. It's a really good performance tool, the way that you can also hold track and go under trig menu and change the probability for all the tracks at once. And go in and change the filter. Add some reverb, some delay, and revert back to the original pattern. It's something found on most Elektron devices, but I feel that it's especially useful and well implemented on the Syntakt. Pretty crazy stuff. Next up, I want to show you the Syntakt workflow and how to make some music using it. So let's start with the analog track here. Let's load a preset. Okay, I like this one. I usually change to 64 steps. I can also set quantize. So usually I set per track and about 99 or 80 or something, 88 is fine. We can enable the metronome, so it's on. Now we also got a little count in. You're accessing this by holding function on this button here, and then you can turn the click on and off and put up pre-roll if you want to. Let's change the tempo, taking it down a bit. Keyboard mode and record. Let's find a snare we like this one. Quantize. Some hi-hats. Let's just do something fast and simple like this. Set LFO to panning. Set the second LFO to amp volume. I want to change the reverb. I usually shelve off some of the low end and some of the top as well. Give it a bit more pre-delay. And I want another snare on top of this as well, because this one is kind of weak. Okay, this one's nice. What else do we want? Let's try and find a nice synth sound to layer on top. So we can go in here and we can filter and we filter for, you can see here, lead, pad, bass. So let's try bass, see if we can find something that works on top of it. The machine we're using here is the synth chord machine, and it's set to unison ×2. Let's copy the pattern and remove these synth sounds. So we just have the bass. And let's find a lead sound that we think could work for some kind of lead melody. Let's see if we can find a pad sound that works on top of this. So let's see here, pad. And of course we have to try CTRL All. Next up, I want to talk about sound locks, because that's a really important part of the Elektron workflow. I think that the brilliant thing is that you can really create some quite interesting, varied beats. Just really quick. Let's send these tracks to the analog effects block. Start out in an empty pattern, go to track number 1, hit function, sound, sound manager, and now we see a list of different presets. Some of them can't be loaded. If they're, for example, an analog sound that uses an analog engine, then we have to be on an analog track. Go back to a digital track, can't load it. Say we like this one, we press yes, get a little check mark. Let's find a hi-hat, so we can filter, select hi-hat. And now with this sound selected, we hit right, we hit copy to, yes, sound pool. Now to create a beat here, we're gonna lock sounds to steps. So we're holding down a step here, turning this knob here, selecting sounds from the sound pool list. So I want a kick here. Just do a simple beat. And I want a bass. So now we built a little groove here using just one track. So it's just one track active, but with multiple sounds utilizing different digital machines. Here's another example. We have all the tracks muted except one, so everything you're hearing is coming from one track. As long as you've gone into the sound manager and actually loaded the sounds you want into the sound pool, it's a really quick way to create a little groove fast just using one track. So while I think that the 12 tracks that we have are plenty enough, just being able to sound lock opens up some interesting creative possibilities. And before the next part, here's a word from today's sponsor. Here's 5 reasons to try out DistroKid. Firstly, you sign up for about $20 a year and you can upload unlimited amounts of music. Secondly, it's really quick and easy to upload. Basically, anyone can do it without any prior knowledge. 3. There are different tiers of subscriptions, so if you want to release your music under, say, different artist names, or if you're starting a label, DistroKid has an option for you. 4. DistroKid lets you upload to relevant stores and streaming services such as Spotify and iTunes, and it doesn't take long for the music to be available in the stores. 5. There's also the hyperfollow feature, which automatically creates a custom page where people can find out where to buy or listen to your music, and I personally really like this feature. So go and check out DistroKid using my link in the description, you get a little discount and you support the channel. Next up, let's talk live performance controls. So there's a couple of things that I want to mention. We can have a pattern playing, and you can use these 2 arrows here to speed up the playback 10% or speed it down. Which can be handy in certain situations live. We also have these 4 new trig modifiers. They aren't on the Digitact and Digitone, and they can also be programmed. So the first one is for re-triggering the sound. So and you can set it by pressing function and up, and here we can set the speed. But that's not all. If we hit function and the second one and up, you can now set 4 different velocities here. So we can have 2 that are lower velocity and 2 that are higher velocity. You can record using them. So now we recorded the snare with different velocities. The third and fourth basically lets you set a parameter, for example, reverb send. So now we can trigger the snare sound with 4 different levels of reverb send, for example. And the fourth one works the same way. Currently, there is no way to use these 2 modifiers without actually triggering the track sound, and I would love to see Elektron change this so you could use these buttons here, these 2, without triggering the track sound. For example, you have something going, say a snare, and then you just press the button, and instead of triggering the sound, you would actually just increase the level of reverb send, for example. That would be very good, very usable. You can also control the unit via CC messages, so you could set up a MIDI controller or use a keyboard to control and play the Syntakt as well. And this way you can also access some macro controls, because you can set up, for example, here, the pitch bend to control multiple parameters. And set the depth. So basically, when you use the pitch bend on a MIDI keyboard, you'd control these parameters here, and the same for the velocity modulation wheel, breath controller, and aftertouch. So these are like macro controls that you can program and use to control the unit via, say, a MIDI keyboard. Next up, let's talk a little bit more about the effects track. So if we press FX, we are now in the effects track mode. And by using these buttons here, they're yellow, we can now change the settings for the analog effects block, which is basically like a thing that processes all the tracks that you send to it. So I hit function, effects, and now I can send all the tracks I want. I can also send the effects, so the reverb and delay. I can also send the input, so we can actually take audio, incoming audio from the outside through the inputs here and process it through the effects block. So now I'm sending all of the tracks through the analog effects. So we have a drive. We also have an analog filter. As well as an ARM section where you can take the entire signal through the analog effects and then send it to the reverb and delay again. What's also really nice is that we have two dedicated LFOs for the analog effects. So we can set up the two LFOs to control the filter. What's also nice is that if we press record, we now have the same sequencer that we have for the other tracks, but for the analog effects. So for example, we could use this to program more drive, for example, on certain steps. Here it is, without any effects. Just an example, but it has a ton of potential, something that I think a lot of you will enjoy, something that I find incredibly powerful. The fact that you can use the Syntakt as an external effects processor is also an added benefit. So we have digital effects, the reverb and the delay, and we also have the analog effects block, so we can route audio through it. You can route incoming audio either as mono or as stereo, so now it's routing the audio from the Pulsar 23 as mono into the Syntakt. And in the mixer section here, we have the in, left and right, so we can set the level. We have delay send, reverb send, panning. You can also set the effects here, pre or post. And this is what it sounds like dry. Now from the mixer menu, we could add some reverb and delay. But that's not an elegant way of doing things. Instead, we press function, effects, and now we can route the incoming audio to the effects track. And if we go into the effects track here, you can see that I've already programmed something. What have I programmed? Well, I have programmed some reverb. So everything that's routed through the effects track gets sent to the reverb. And in terms of analog effects, we have drive. There's also an analog filter with different filter types. We can, of course, live record changes to the filter. And there's also an amp envelope. We also have an LFO, which is similar to the track LFOs that we have, and it's also similar to what we have on the Digitakt. And there's also some interesting LFO options. We can set it to in, left and right, we can set it to balance, delay send, reverb send. So basically the mixer settings, we can set it to pre or post for the effects as well, and you can have an LFO impact that. So that's kind of interesting that we can actually impact the mixer settings for the inputs. So we can pan the input, for example. We can control the incoming audio level using an LFO. And there's definitely a lot of things to say about using the Syntakt as an external audio processor. Hopefully this has given you some ideas. And here's with some added Syntakt percussions. Using the Syntakt with an external synthesizer worked surprisingly well. When using a MIDI track, you can program or record up to 4 notes of polyphony. And it's much easier to record polyphonic stuff into the sequencer than programming it on the sequencer. The Syntakt has one DIN MIDI input and 2 outputs, and here I've connected the inputs and outputs to the Hydrasynth Explorer so I can use its keyboard to play and record into the Syntakt. Now the absolutely coolest thing is that you can route the audio from an external synth or drum machine through the analog effects block. Just like on the Digitakt, you can set up different CC values and have the Digitakt's sequencer control any external gear. So what do I dislike? Well, there's just 2 things. There's no true polyphonic machine. So there's the chord machine, but I would have loved to see a true polyphonic machine. I also do not like the chord machine in particular. I didn't like it on the model cycles. It just doesn't work for me. Maybe it will for you. But I rarely find like a good use for it. Maybe I'm doing something wrong here, maybe it's me and not the machine, but I feel like a proper polyphonic machine would have been much better. Now granted, polyphonic sequencing on the Digitakt, you can do it, you can do 4-note polyphonic sequencing using the MIDI tracks, but it's a little wonky, it's a little difficult to program. It's kind of nice just to record into it. That works pretty well using a MIDI keyboard for polyphonic stuff using the MIDI tracks. So maybe a polyphonic machine wouldn't work that well either. So yeah, I don't know. It's just something that I'm missing from this device. So you'll get around this by connecting a hardware synthesizer that can do polyphonic stuff, and you can use the MIDI tracks to sequence it pretty well. So that's the workaround, but it's something that I'm missing. I also have a wish, and that is that Elektron does something more with the new trig modifiers. As is, you always have to trigger the track sound when using the trig modifiers, and I think that an option where the trig modifiers just triggers the effect and not the sound itself would be good. You could use it, for example, to trigger a ramp up in reverb send, for example, without triggering the sound, and it doesn't seem like that's possible currently. But of course, they have a lot of room to grow in terms of these new trig modifiers. It's the first device that have them in this way. So maybe something like that could be implemented in the future. You can take that idea, Elektron, and do what you want with it. Other than that, this is a really good Groovebox, especially for anyone looking to get into their first Elektron device or someone who already loves their products. If you're like me and you're a Digitakt and Digitone lover, you can't go wrong with this. And that's so nice. It also pairs up really well with those devices if you want to build a little hardware rig with the Digitakt, Digitone, and the Syntakt. And yes, I'm a proud Elektron fanboy. And yes, Elektron sent this device over to me, but I've had a really good time with it. It's one of the best Grooveboxes that I've ever used. It even beats the Digitakt for me. It's more usable. I can make more music with it. It's more fun, more immediate. And that's saying something, since I'm probably among the top 3 Digitakt fans on YouTube. I think it's simply that everything is coming together with this machine. You have the Digitakt workflow, the beefy analog kicks from the analog rhythm, the snares, the dual VCO, and you have the digital sound shaping tools that are like beefed up versions of the ones in the model cycles. So overall, it's just a great machine. So be sure to let us all know what you think about the Syntakt, what other content you want to see me make with it. If this is for you, let us know down in the comment section. And as always, Thank you for being here, and thank you to today's sponsor, DistroKid. Be sure to check them out, linked in the description as well. As always, have a great day and talk to you later.